Greetings and welcome back to our series on the parables of Jesus. We're continuing these video lessons that focus on the parables of Jesus, or those things that have been called earthly stories with heavenly meanings. They're simple stories that are designed to teach moral or spiritual lessons. Several of the last parables that we have taken a look at have been some of the lesser known ones. And while it's fun to tell the golden oldies, it's also good to get off the beaten path of storytelling. That's how we can see the other side of Jesus. We can take a look at some different teachings as well as some different theology. And that's where we're going to spend our time in this study. The parable that we're going to look at now is called the parable of the heart. It's found in Matthew chapter 15 and in Mark chapter 7. And we're going to read it from Mark's account. Mark chapter 7, verses 14 through 23. After he called the crowd to him again, he began saying to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside the man which can defile him if it goes into him, but the things which proceed out of the man are what defile the man. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear." When he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples questioned him about the parable. And he said to them, "Are you so lacking in understanding also? Do you not understand that whatever goes into the man from outside cannot defile him, because it does not go into his heart, but into his stomach and is eliminated?" Thus he declared all foods clean. And he was saying that which proceeds out of the man, that is what defiles the man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed the evil thoughts, fornications, thefts, murders, adulteries, deeds of coveting and wickedness, as well as deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these evil things proceed from within and defile the man. By the time that we get to this part of Jesus' life, the Jewish religious leaders are very familiar with what they might be calling this new guy. I doubt that there are times when Jesus makes a public appearance that one of the scribes or Pharisees or someone who is looking out after their interests isn't somewhere close around. And not only are they listening to what he is saying, they're also listing what he's doing. On this day, Jesus' disciples didn't wash their hands before they ate. Now, this may sound a bit odd, but washings were a big deal to the scribes and Pharisees. Some of it may have had to do with hygiene, but the biggest violation is probably perceived to be spiritual. Mark explains this in a section that precedes what we read a minute ago. In fact, it's Mark chapter 7, verses 3 and 4, where he writes, "For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they carefully wash their hands, thus observing the traditions of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they cleanse themselves. And there are many other things which they have received in order to observe, such as the washing of cups and pitchers and copper pots." Their objection wasn't merely that Jesus and the disciples were being nasty. The issue was they perceived them as being naughty, and they confront him about it. Again, look at verse 5. It says, "The Pharisees and the scribes asked him, 'Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat their bread with impure hands?'" Jesus' initial response to this question indicates that he wasn't going to put up with some kind of spiritual foolishness. He condemns their duplicity, and then he highlights their spirit in Mark chapter 7, verses 6 through 8. Mark records, "And he said to them, 'Rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far away from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men. Neglecting the commandment of God, you hold to the tradition of men.'" And it's set within this backdrop that Jesus tells a story. The story begins with a declarative statement. He says, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside the man which can defile him if it goes into him, but the things which proceed out of the man are what defile the man." This may have troubled the religious leaders, but it freed the people from the dietary restrictions that had all but enslaved them, and especially those of the Old Testament. And we'll see this interwoven into this teaching. There's something new that is being taught, and it has less to do with what people eat and more to do with the way that people live. Now, while this is pretty straightforward to those of us who have read the rest of the Bible, especially Acts chapter 10, not everyone understood what he was saying. When the crowds were gone, when they dispersed sometime after Jesus teaching this parable, the inner circle of disciples asked for a clarification. When you think about this, this really is cutting-edge theology. And I'm sure that they wanted to get the principle correct. Not only would it impact their eating habits, it would also impact their religious habits. As Jesus explains the parable in private, he uses a biological example to teach this spiritual lesson. People are not defiled by what they put into their bodies. They defile themselves by what comes out of their hearts. When food is internalized, it's processed and then eliminated. But when people do or say something, it shows their spiritual makeup forever. The way people act is indicative of how they think and what they believe. In other words, a good heart is bound to produce good deeds, but an evil heart or an evil soul or an evil mind produces evil thoughts. And Jesus uses this opportunity to highlight some of those things that they needed to avoid. He talks about fornication, thefts, murders, adulteries, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. Jesus says that you have to stay away from these things because those are, pardon the expression, but crimes of the heart, sins that are coming from the inside. According to Jesus, these are the things that defile humans. It's not what people eat or how they prepare for a meal that makes someone unclean. We're defiled by how we think, because how we think dictates what we do. Now, what is Jesus trying to teach? What is he trying to get across to the people of his day? I think the disciples needed to understand a couple of things. The first one is they needed to realize the difference between the teachings of God and the traditions of men. Even what might be called spiritually based traditions. Yes, the Old Testament had dietary restrictions, but those had run their course. And in fact, the way that they were being taught and perceived by the Pharisees, they were no longer as applicable as they were when they were originally given. Was it that God was wrong? No. It was that the traditions of men had overwhelmed what God had originally intended. From here on out, the heart was going to be more important than the hands or the mouth. It wasn't their hygiene that would please God. It was going to be their high morals. And I think a second thing that needs to be brought out and seems to be brought out in this parable is they needed to realize that the thoughts that guided their actions were how they were going to be judged. Again, sure, actions are important. However, the measuring stick is what led to those actions. The physical law was being replaced with the spiritual process. I think if you go back and you look at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, it's something that you start to see as a transition in godliness. I think you begin to see some of some of this introduced in the Sermon on the Mount. But it would be tough if they missed out on it here. They may not have been prepared for it on the Sermon on the Mount, but Jesus is pretty upfront about the expectations from this point forward. The disciples needed to realize the importance of the inner person. They'd grown up in a tradition-based application of their religion that tended to focus on the outer person. But now they needed to be able to live and teach a heartfelt religion. Very important parable, but one that we typically don't spend a lot of time on. Now, what does it teach us today? We're not really obligated to those dietary restrictions in Christianity, so what can this teach us? To be honest, few of us have ever been challenged, at least theologically, for not washing our hands before we ate. Or have we? Now, again, moms don't count in this discussion. They need to encourage us to wash our hands and practice good hygiene. Moms are okay. But we need to be careful that we don't overemphasize the concept of the body being the temple of God. You probably have heard this. It comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, when Paul wrote, "Do you not know that you are a temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, and that is what you are." It would be easy to get the idea of the human body being the temple of God and taking it way far away from the concept. But when you go back and you look at the context in which Paul writes this, is he referring to what we put in our bodies, or is he referring to how we build our lives around Jesus Christ, the founder and the foundation of our faith? And I think it's going to be the second. He's not necessarily talking as much about what goes into our bodies as what is being produced from our bodies, which are the new temples of God. Throughout my lifetime, there's always been a teaching of how we need to take care of our physical structures, these things that we call our bodies. But is that the essence of our faith? Is eating junk food defiling our religion? Is getting a vaccination against a disease, is it a sin? I think that this teaching of Jesus reminds us that we need to be more focused on our heart than our body. Which is more dangerous? Not maintaining a good fitness routine or abandoning our sexual purity? Which marks us as belonging to the world? Getting a shot or taking a shot at someone who disagrees with our political or religious opinion? Which is more indicative of being a Christian? Taking care of my body or taking care of our neighbors while we travel life's highway together? Folks, I like religious traditions as much as the next person, and I believe that we should do what we ought to do to make a good impression on the world. But we also need to remember that what truly sets us apart are our spiritual lives. Let's not just be aware of looking good. Let's make sure that we are being good. Now some thought and discussion questions. Number one, are there some substances we should avoid putting in our bodies? If so, why? Number two, what is the difference between looking good and being good? Number three, are there some things we do today that are more religious tradition than spiritual necessity?